Hello and welcome to the Iain Dale All Talk podcast. I'm Iain Dale. Today we're going to talk to somebody who's been in the Westminster lobby for 40 years, almost exactly, celebrated his 40th anniversary a couple of weeks ago. It is, of course, Jon Craig, Chief Political Correspondent at Sky News. Welcome, Jon.
Thank you.
That's quite a milestone, isn't it?
If you'd said to me on January the 11th, I think it was, 1982, I was aged 24. I'd just come down from the Evening Gazette in Middlesbrough to join the Thomson Regional Newspaper's parliamentary team. If you'd said to me then, you'll still be there 40 years later, I said, nah, that'd be daft. Go and work in Fleet Street, something like that. Well, I did go and work in national newspapers, but of course in the press gallery, in the lobby.
A 24-year-old joining the lobby now, what differences are there, do you think?
When I get asked for advice, which I often do, and I'm sure you do as well, from young people who are, say, at City University doing their broadcasting course or whatever, I think these days I would probably not start on regional papers, although in those days, Thomson Regional Newspapers had a great graduate training scheme. There was a guy called John Brownlee. It was called the Brownlee Academy up in Newcastle. And people like Andrew Marr, the person who was my boss in that Thomson team, Phil Johnston, now writes columns for the Telegraph and leader columns. The legendary Brian Taylor, who was such a big presence, literally, in Scotland as their political
we
editor.
often interview him as effectively our quasi-Scottish
but
political commentator.
Lionel Barber, the editor of the FT, we all started with the Thomson Regional Newspaper scheme. I think these days I'd say go to broadcasting or a website. I mean, everything has changed so much. I mean, when I first started in the press gallery, you used to type your copy on a typewriter, you used to place it in a wire basket, and then it would be typed again by a surly member of the National Graphical Association, who you often used to have to drag out of the press bar to do it. I remember one night on budget night when the basket was like this, and I said, do you mind please going and sending some copy? No, we're on our break. I mean, that was what it was like in there. That was pre-whopping, of course. And then it was typed again at the various papers. I worked mainly for the morning papers in Thomson's. It was the Newcastle Journal in Scotland, in the northeast of England, the Preston Journal, the P&J in the north of Scotland, and the Western Mail, the morning paper in Cardiff.
Because one thing I didn't know about you is that you are actually a northerner.
Born in the Wirral.
Yeah.
Clatterbridge Hospital in the Wirral South constituency, currently held by Alison McGovern. Often visited by prime ministers and party leaders at election times. Yeah, grew up in Cheshire and then Yorkshire. Went to school, King's School, Macclesfield. And my late father was an engineer with the Central Electricity Generating Board, and he moved from the northwest to northeast. So I then went to Wetherby High School and Tadcaster Grammar School.
Because I can't trace any semblance of a northern accent with you.
I suppose at 18 I went to Southampton University, and I've lived in the south of England ever since I was 18. That's probably why. And also, this is my broadcasting voice, Ian.
Oh, you have a different one, do you?
Oh, probably. My wife says, oh, you sound all northern. I say, on the telly I don't.
Which is actually, if you think about it nowadays, I think it's an advantage to have a regional accent in the media. Even newsreaders now, I mean, 20 years ago, all newsreaders on BBC or commercial, they would have all been expected to have a standard accent. Whereas now, it's almost spot the received pronunciation.
In broadcasting, there have long been, haven't there, broadcasters from Scotland and Northern Ireland in particular, I'm thinking of. I mean, I remember the great John Cole, who was the BBC political...
Undoubtedly, Mrs. Thatcher.
Indeed. And, of course, the BBC had Scots. We mentioned Brian Taylor, but Andrew Marr. And I suppose these days on the BBC, you've got Hugh Edwards and the great John Humphreys, who was on the Today programme for years and years and years. And are there strong northern accents? Not that many, it has to be said, in broadcasting. Yes, you're right. There was a time when, I mean, Nadine Dorries was talking about this in her statement on the BBC in the Commons when she was talking about freezing the licence fee. She's talking about the London bubble. And I remember Oliver Dowden, when he was Culture Secretary, was going on about the BBC needed to get out of London more and reflect the views of people out in the regions much more. Well, you see, I started working for regional papers, so I got to know all the Northeast MP, a lot of the Northeast MPs in those days were people from a local government background. They were real Geordie characters, some of them. And, of course, there were some great Scots amongst the Scottish MPs as well. Then, of course, I suppose you'd say the Blair years, as well as Tony Blair in what was then the new seat of Sedgefield, you had people like Stephen Byers came into Parliament, Alan Milburn, although he was quite a Geordie, Alan Milburn. I mean, he famously worked in that legendary, you might say, notorious bookshop on Tyneside.
Yes.
Days of Hope, which, of course, was known as Haze of Dope, for obvious reasons.
Yeah, when I ran a bookshop, it wasn't quite like that.
You ran a magnificent bookshop. That's where you and I first met.
It was, yes.
Yeah, great shop.
Let's take you back to 1982, when you first came to the Houses of Parliament. Had you always wanted to be a journalist?
Yes. Well, when I say yes, since when I went to university and did law, and at that point, I think at 18, I wanted to go on and become a solicitor. That's certainly what my parents wanted.
Yeah.
But, of course, like so many people who are now journalists, I got involved with a student paper. It was called Wessex News. I look at it back now and think, oh, it was awful. And more and more I thought, oh, this is what I want to do. So I applied for all the various graduate training schemes, of which at the time there was the Thomson one, which was seen as a really good one. The BBC, there was Westminster Press, there was the Mirror Group, where people like Alistair Campbell started. And Alistair and I are roughly the same age. And what happened was, in my third year, I got elected Students' Union president. And I had to ring up various people and say, look, I want to defer my application for your graduate training scheme. And they all said, with one exception, oh, you'll have to apply again. And Thomson said, don't worry about it. We will keep a place for you. So I went to Thomson Regional Newspapers. And it was a great place to start. The North East, great place to start as a journalist. And there's all those papers up there, the Thomson papers. I think they went into Trinity Mirror at one point, I think. You have the Journal, the morning paper. They were broadsheet in those days, the Chronicle, the evening paper, and the paper called the Sunday Sun. That's why the Sun on Sunday is not called the Sunday Sun, because there's a regional paper up there. And it was great fun. It was great training. We used to go on district drives to places like Blythe in Northumberland and come back with as many stories as we could. I mean, you talk to Andy Marr, he'll tell you the same stories. It was a great way to start.
You see, modern-day journalists don't have that experience, do they? It's actually comparatively rare now for a regional journalist to break into the national lobby, and yet you have all that experience there.
I think there are some, aren't there?
But not as many as they used to be.
No. I mean, a lot of the younger people go on work for the political websites now, which is fine. And the whole nature of political reporting has changed, of course, because it's so much more immediate. I mean, working on a morning paper, you'd file in the afternoon. These days, if you're a political correspondent on a regional or a national paper, you're knocking out copy for a website first thing in the morning to the last thing at night. It's all very different now. In those days, how many stories a day did I write? I can't remember now, but I suppose quite a few. And regional papers in those days were really strong, some of them. I mean, there are great titles like the Yorkshire Post was a great provincial paper. That, I think I'm right in saying, is still broadsheet, whereas a lot of papers, when I was working for papers like the Thomson papers, the P&J was broadsheet, the Western Mail was broadsheet, the Journal was broadsheet, the Scotsman was broadsheet in those days, and the Belfast Telegraph, all the big titles of Thomson regional newspapers were all broadsheet and quite successful, but obviously that's all changed.
And also, MPs were obsessed with servicing their local newspaper. And I started a job as a researcher in the Commons 3 years after you went there for Patrick Thomson, who was a Norwich MP.
Remember him?
And the EDP, I mean, that was the
Eastern
Holy
Daily
Grail.
Press.
He was far more interested in getting a story in that than he was in a national newspaper.
I remember take the Journal, for example. Alan Beath was the MP, the Liberal MP in those days for Berwick, which, of course, is a vast rural constituency. And, of course, it was known up the North East as the Farmer's Bible. So stories about rural Northumberland. I used to fill the county edition with stories about Alan Beath. But also, I mean, the other thing, of course, in 1983, Sedgefield was the last constituency to select, because it was a brand new constituency. And there were people like Sid Wheel, a former NUR General Secretary, Les Huckfield, who I think had lost his seat, and of course Tony Blair, who had fought the Beaconsfield by-election in '82 and by all accounts done quite well, got selected. So one of the great advantages for me was that I knew Tony Blair well from the day he was elected in 1983. And I also remember working on regional papers, a bit of advice from a guy called John Deans, who worked for the, after Thomson Regional Newspapers, he was the chief political correspondent, went on to the Daily Record, in the Scottish paper, and then for many years the Daily Mail. His advice was stick close to these local MPs because when you're on a national newspaper, they'll be in the cabinet. And of course, Blair went on to become Prime Minister. I remember I had to tip various people for promotion. And of course, naturally, I tipped Blair because you would. It was obvious. And I remember actually when he became, I think it's when he became Prime Minister, Alistair Campbell, for some reason, somebody had drawn to his attention this piece I wrote in whatever year it was, mid-'80s, tipping Blair for great things. Now, what I said was, this was, of course, I think was it in the Foot years? Or in the Kinnock years, I can't remember.
Well, he was elected in the '83 election.
I said if Labour get their act together or something like that, Blair will be Prime Minister in the early 21st century. Now, what I would say in my defence for not getting that quite right...
It's not bad.
No, but what I will say to this day, had John Smith not died in 1994, I think probably... Smith would have won in '97, but with a much smaller majority, and then Blair would probably have taken over, as I say, a few years later.
Politics is wonderful for all the what-ifs that you can talk about, aren't they? But did you exploit that relationship with Blair in any way?
Always got on well with him. If ever I turned up to something and he didn't want to do interviews, I don't think he ever turned me down.
And that's very useful, isn't it? And in many ways, that opens things up to new jobs, doesn't it? When somebody knows that you are close to the Prime Minister. Yeah.
I've often said also, not who you are, it's who you work for. At Sky News, if people want to get something out into the public domain quickly, they come to us. And as you'll know this, there are certain stories which lend themselves to Sunday papers. Yeah. There are certain stories that perhaps lend themselves to radio. Your evening show, for example. I always remember when I went to the Sunday Times. The Sunday Times was my first national newspaper in 1986. And I suddenly found Norman Tebbit was party chairman. And Norman Tebbit would suddenly ring me. And I thought, gosh, this didn't happen before. The other thing I remember was when I went
Did it strike fear into you?
Well, pussycat.
He's got the limpest handshake, hasn't he, Norman Tebbit?
I never really thought about that.
No, actually. He really does.
I can think of one other politician now deceased who had a very limp handshake. But I remember I worked for the late and many would say unlamented Today newspaper, and the relations with Conservative politicians were not great. And then I went to the Daily Express, and suddenly Tory cabinet ministers were talking to me again. So it's not who you are, it's who you work for. I've never sort of arrogantly thought that it's because of who I am, it's who I work for.
Well, it is partly who you are, because I think politicians do tend to gravitate to people that they like. They're human beings just like anybody else. And you've always been, certainly in my experience, somebody who... comes across as a nice guy. So
do my best.
There are plenty of journalists I would not necessarily say that about, and I think they suffer from that. But then they would in any other walk of life as well.
I noticed that you and I were the only two journalists who got an interview with Barry Gardner.
Yes,
Beijing Barry, as they're now called.
I was furious that he
did you first. What were you furious about?
Well, because I persuaded him to do it.
Well, I had to persuade him as well.
No. But see, he had said no first of all.
Yes.
And his team had said no.
Yes.
And so I said to because my producer, Robbie, had gone to him. We should explain, for people who are listening to this in 2 years' time, Barry Gardner was involved in a Labour MP, involved in a scandal about taking donations from somebody who turned out to be, should we say, rather close to the Chinese Conservative Party. And
but she was a spy.
Well, she was
a spy, according to MI5.
Depends on your definition,
letter to MPs.
Yeah. And... so I said to Robbie, my producer, when they said no, I said, OK, leave it to me. So I WhatsApped Barry and I said, look, you're going to have to say something at some point. You might as well say it today, get it out of the way, and say it to somebody who you know is not going to stitch you up. So I said, let me think about it. So they came back and they said, Yeah, we will do it, but we're going to do Jon Craig on Sky first. I was thinking, you tosser.
Are you referring to Barry or me
I
there?
couldn't possibly comment. So, of course, I then spent 20 minutes. He said, it's only going to be 5 minutes with Jon Craig. And I thought, I know Jon Craig. He's going to eke out as much of this as he can.
It's one of those. I mean, sometimes, because we're a 24-hour news channel, we're not what they call in TV built programmes. You can, if somebody's good, keep it going. And the gallery was saying, keep this going, keep this going. I mean, sometimes I've been in the central lobby interviewing MPs, and you thought the interview's coming to a natural end, and the gallery say, the next guest hasn't turned up. Can you keep this going? But that did not happen on this occasion.
No, and it was, I was sitting there thinking, oh, God, how am I going to top this? I can't think of any questions that I can ask that he hasn't already been asked. But it was quite an evening in many ways. Technology. You mentioned there when you first started in the Commons, it was sort of you type something out and then somebody else had to file it.
Yeah.
How have you adapted to all the technological demands that there have been, particularly since the advent of the internet, social media, and all the rest of it?
I think my younger colleagues in the Sky News office would say badly. So, I mean, the first development, I suppose, was when we got those machines called Tandies. Do you remember those?
No.
They were little laptops. And I remember, I think it was when I was on the... Actually, no, the first time I knew technology, as it was then called, when I went to Wapping. So in 1986, when the Wapping dispute happened, there were all the refuseniks, as they were called, many of whom had gone off to the Independent, which was new, and some had gone off to the Observer. And so Andrew Neil was on a big recruiting spree, and there was a real class of 86, of which I was one. And that was, of course, the first time I'd ever used a computer at my desk. And it was great. I mean, compared with a typewriter, as you know, the computer, I mean, if you make a mistake when you've got a piece of paper and carbon, you've probably got to type it all again. But you can correct your mistakes. So there's no excuse for sloppy copy, bad punctuation or anything like that. So, yes, that was the first time. So I suppose in that respect, I was a bit of a pioneer because I'd gone to work at Wapping. And, of course, there were all the demos on a Saturday night and everything. It was all a bit unpleasant. Then I went to the Today newspaper. That's when we had Tandies in the press gallery.
And they were the first colour newspaper, weren't they?
They were. They were launched by Eddie Shah.
Yeah.
But by the time I went there, David Montgomery was the editor. And it was part of the News International company at that time. And then I went to the Daily Express. And of course, technology was moving on. I mean, the other great change was mobile phones, of course. I mean, I remember the first time I used a mobile phone. It was at the Sunday Times. There was a managing editor there called Peter Roberts. And if you went out on a story and you'd go to the managing editor's office and you'd pick up this thing that was about the size of a car battery and you'd take it out. And I also remember a bit later on, actually, I had a very big mobile phone. Remember those enormous mobile?
So Vodafone, they were like a brick, weren't they?
One of my colleagues exactly used to call it the talking brick.
Yeah.
And now, of course, we have these little things, which you can do all sorts. You can use them as cameras and goodness knows what else.
I remember in 1989 when I was working for the ports industry and the dock labour scheme was abolished, and that was my first brush with the media in many ways. And during the dock strike, I said to my boss, right, you and I have got to have mobile phones. And so these mobile phones arrived, and I mean, they were like a brick, and I felt terribly important having one. But it was absolutely vital in that kind of environment.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can remember when we were trainees up in the northeast, you'd have to go to the phone box. And, of course, they were all often vandalised in those days.
Put your 10p's in.
And, well, you'd reverse the charges to file copy to a newspaper. And, of course, copy takers. Copy takers were amazing. You'd be filing away and they'd say, "Is there much more of this?" And I also remember, I used to, the press gallery of the House of Commons, where the press gallery is at the end of the chamber above the Speaker, there is the gallery where journalists sit. At the other end is the public gallery where the public are. And you go out of the gallery and there is like a bank of little phone booths.
Yeah.
And sometimes we'd file, if you were in a real hurry, you'd file a story over the phone rather than type it out. I remember Nigel Lawson's resignation in 1989, I think it was, when I was on Today. Thatcher had just come back from a Commonwealth summit in Harare, I think I'm right in saying. And I remember filing that. And I've never told him this, but Michael Jones was the political editor of the Sunday Times with whom I'd worked, a lovely guy. I could hear him on the phone, perhaps to Andrew Neil, I'm not sure, in the next booth. And I was filing copy to Today. And every time Michael came out with a good phrase, I'd put it in my copy. But then we were always, John Brownlee always taught us as trainees, rat like cunning, that's what you need.
And again, going back to the mid-1980s, I remember the first day that I worked in the Commons and walking from Central Lobby through to the House of Lords, and there coming towards me was Jim Callaghan with President Ford. And I thought to myself, what's a boy from Essex doing in a place like this? Did you ever have any sort of imposter syndrome?
You do. It is amazing who you bump into. I mean, in terms of politicians, you just bump into. I mean, for example, I've met John Kerry a few times in the House of Parliament because he's been there as guests of Lindsay Hoyle. And yes, you can be wondering. I remember the early days bumping into the likes of Willie Whitelaw, who was a great figure in the 80s. Every Prime Minister needs a Willie, that famous phrase. I always remember when he was Home Secretary, he had some dreadful scrapes as Home Secretary. I always remember one time when he was under pressure, an MP said to him, why have you done this? Because I believe it is the right decision. It's a classic Willieism. But yes, around Parliament, and you bump into all sorts of celebrities, don't you? I remember, I know Ian Rankin, the great Rebus author, a bit. So I've met him through a mutual friend, a comedian called John Maloney. And funnily enough, I'd been with him on the Sunday. On the Monday, I was doing lives in the Central Lobby. And who comes through but the great Ken Stott? I couldn't believe it. I've been with Ian Rankin on the Sunday, and here's Ken Stott, the great actor. And there's always politicians, I think, probably more than journalists, love celebrities, don't they?
Yeah.
Sportsmen and women.
Well, they think as the stardust rubs off on them somehow.
Yes. I mean, there's always, as you will know, receptions for successful football teams, cricket teams, and so on the House of Commons terrace. And I've often thought that a lot of political journalists are frustrated sports hacks. Now, I know you're a massive West Ham fan. I don't recall actually West Ham coming to the Commons for any sort of victory reception.
Not yet, John. That could happen soon.
But I remember, one of the things that's, I remember going to interview, not the time when England won the Ashes and Peterson and Freddie Flintoff were drunk, but another occasion. I remember going to. They'd won a T20 when Paul Colling was captain, interviewing these England cricketers, great, and meeting people like Graham Swan, I remember, in the Strangers Bar. And I remember also, what's his name? Alan Pardew was West Ham manager, wasn't he, at one stage?
Was, yeah.
Meeting him in the Strangers Bar with the late Tony Banks, who was MP for West Ham. And I remember there was a tennis reception in Downing Street, interviewing Federer and people like that. Marvellous. And also, I mean, just so whilst I'm being a sort of a groupie, the Olympics. I mean, if you ask me one of my highlights, the 2008 Olympic Games. What happened was Gordon Brown went off to Afghanistan on the way, and I think we might have gone somewhere else on the way to Beijing, and of course. We were broadcast. Kay Burley was presenting. We were broadcasting a lot from Beijing, including that last night when Boris Johnson, who was then Mayor of London, made that whiff-waff speech. Do you remember that? Yeah. And I remember interviewing David Beckham that night because, of course, it was all about the next Olympics too. And I remember interviewing Beckham and Beckham was, oh, Sir Alex, like a father to me. And on the plane coming back, I told Gordon Brown this story, and Gordon said, well, that's funny because he told me that if Sir Alex was managing the Great Britain football team, he wouldn't pick me.
Yeah, they did have a bit of a falling out, didn't they?
So foreign trips are obviously a great highlight. I remember a great trip with Blair to California when Schwarzenegger was governor, wasn't he, of California. And I remember asking Blair a question which Schwarzenegger, at a press conference, which Schwarzenegger thought was a bit hostile. He said, hey, you shouldn't be talking to your Prime Minister like that. And then I remember a few years later when David Cameron took Schwarzenegger to a meeting of the 1922 committee. And we're all out in the corridor, there's Cameron and Schwarzenegger. And one of Schwarzenegger's team said to him, "That's that guy who asked Blair that question." And he remembered that was Cameron, of course, thought that was hilarious. It's great. It's all great fun. I mean, the very first big story I remember in 1982 was Mark Thatcher getting lost in the desert. Do you remember that was a big story at the time?
Yeah, massive.
And I remember Bernard Ingham coming into the press gallery to do a briefing, which was amazing at the time. And then, of course, 1982 was the year of the Falklands War. I mean, that was a dramatic period in Parliament. The Commons sat on Easter Saturday and went right through to June when the surrender of the Argentinians at Port Stanley. I remember the intro that we filed, our team. "The white flag of surrender was flying over Port Stanley last night."
Rejoice.
Point paragraph. Now, rejoice was when they took South Georgia.
I know.
Yeah. And Bernard's briefings, and there were the briefings at the MOD by that civil service. Ian MacDonald,
yes.
That's right. Yeah.
I think he died recently.
I think so, yes. I mean,
it was an amazing time. But you see, this is why I think that you have been in the lobby I mean, if you had to pick any 40 years, you would have picked this 40 years, wouldn't you? I mean, going from the Falklands War right through to Brexit and the shenanigans that are going on at the moment.
I sometimes think, or I used to think, I wish I'd perhaps been in Fleet Street a bit earlier, in the sort of the glory days of Fleet Street, rather than a bit when I was there.
Could your liver have coped?
Don't know. Don't know. I mean, of course, the thing about working in broadcasting, of course, is don't drink on work days, apart from the odd glass of something at a party conference, perhaps. But yeah, an exciting period. Well, Thatcher, her downfall in 1990. I was one of the journalists there in the courtyard of the British Embassy in the Rue Faubourg.
Because all we remember is John Sargent and a little bit of Peter Allen.
Yes. Yes. Bernard Ingham, Sargi was doing a broadcast, and I remember Bernard coming out and pushing Sargi out of the way, as I recall. And was that when she said, "We fight on, we fight to win"? I can't remember.
No, that wasn't.
That was
she said,
it
is my intention
to go in the second round.
Yeah, the fight on, fight to win was, I think, the next day.
So that was dramatic. And then I remember coming back, and I think it was the next night that all the cabinet ministers went into her room, and many of them said to her the game was up. And I also remember I just joined Sky, in 2003. Of course, we had the Iraq War. Whenever I get a new job, there seems to be a war. Falklands at 82, Sky, Iraq. I remember being in the members' lobby, and do you remember we were all waiting to see if there were enough letters to whoever the chairman of the 22 committee was then? I can't remember. Was it Spicer? I can't remember. And I remember an MP telling they've got there, and I think because they had so few MPs, I think it was only 25 or something they needed. And I remember we didn't have a camera over in Parliament at that time. I ran from the central lobby to the Sky studio and did this breathless live about how the Tories MPs had got enough to topple Ian Duncan Smith. And they liked it so much, they ran it as a promo, this breathless political correspondent with this breaking news.
But there has to be a bit of drama, doesn't there, on a 24-hour news channel? You can't just sort of look straight into camera and be solemn. There's got to be a bit of... I mean, that's why I think over the years, Sky has had some brilliant characters, as Judith Dawson, who I just loved as a political correspondent, right in the early days of Sky.
Well, she'd come from radio.
She had, I think she was on LBC, wasn't she?
Yeah.
And Judith, she had this wonderful gravelly voice. Well, Judith Dawson, Sky News.
That's right. I think there were a few ex-LBC people. Wasn't there Peter Spencer?
Oh, was he LBC? I didn't know that.
He was
well,
radio,
he was certainly a character.
He was a character with his light grey bouffant hair, and he had a cape, and he used to smoke a cigarette in a holder.
And everything was pink.
His car was pink.
Yes.
My wife and I once went to stay at a holiday cottage he owned, still does, I think, down in a place called Trebarwith Strand in Cornwall, and even the toaster was pink. The decor was all pink.
But he lives in Cornwall now, doesn't he?
Yes, that's right. He's retired, writing books. And was Richard Bestick ex-IRN
I think he was,
yeah. Yes, there were. These days, Sky tends to recruit political correspondents and other specialists from national newspapers who are already specialists in their field. And most, if you think about it, most political correspondents over in the lobby these days do quite a lot of broadcasting, whether it's paper reviews or punditry, probably more so. I think the first time I ever did, I mean, when I was Students' Union president, I used to do local radio and stuff like that. But I think the first time I did sort of national TV and punditry and stuff was when I was at the Sunday Times. I did a lot of it when I was at Express newspapers. I had 6 years on the Daily Express as political editor and 3 on the Sunday. I was a regular paper reviewer on Sky. And so by the time I moved into broadcasting, I'd done an awful lot of broadcasting.
But that's interesting, isn't it? Because if you look at Beth Rigby and Sam Coates now, they hadn't done a lot of broadcasting before they... I mean, it must be quite a talent for people within Sky to identify people who actually could make the grade as a broadcaster, because not everyone can.
No, there are some newspaper journalists who I won't name who I think are a little bit wooden on
I wonder
TV.
if we're thinking of the same person.
No, I'm not going to name anybody.
No, obviously.
But there are some who are an absolute natural.
Well, look at Joe Pike. I mean, he had been in broadcasting before, but I mean, to me, he is absolutely ideal for Sky News. He can talk about anything at the drop of a hat, just like you can.
Well, in recent weeks, Joe went over to America to provide cover for someone who was, I think, on a holiday. And, of course, he was covering the Maxwell trial. Well, the Maxwell trial. And, of course, since he's come back, he's done stuff about Prince Andrew and Maxwell as well. I mean, Joe had a great career in radio and a very successful career in television in Scotland as well.
Intern.
Sorry?
Started off as my intern.
Did he really? I didn't know that. Wow. You were obviously a great tutor, a great mentor. I mean, I've mentored a few hacks who are doing well over the years. I mean, Tim Shipman was a graduate trainee at the Express, now hugely successful at the Sunday Times. Julia Hartley-Brewer worked with me at the Sunday Express. And there's a few more as well. I would say I always try to be helpful to young journalists, political journalists, obviously I meet mostly. When I first started, age 24, the older guys in the lobby, and there were some real sort of giants, they were so helpful to me. And I thought, I appreciate this so much. I'm always going to go out of my way to help young journalists. There was a guy, I'm thinking of people like Iain Aitken. Now, Iain Aitken was the political editor of The Guardian, and a great, lovely man who he used to have all sorts of phrases like politics is a cross between a soap opera and a spectator sport. And by that, he meant all the intrigue is the soap opera and the spectator sport is the big set pieces at conferences and so on. But people like Iain Aitken and some of the other national newspaper journalists, and in fact, when I was young, a little bit older on a national, but John Cole was always absolutely lovely and helpful towards me as well. And Mike Brunson, I guess, when he was at ITN. Now, people at Sky always say that I like a brandish. I have here, and you know, whether it's a select committee report or whatever. And Mike Brunson, political editor of ITN, distinguished. He was a great one for the brandish. And I remember when we were I was in the Express room with a colleague and friend called Patrick Hennessy, went on to be a political editor, and then went on to be the spokesman for the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. We used to tease Michael. We said, "I have here a press release." It wasn't a press release, of course.
But he was one of the great political broadcasters of all time.
Yeah, Mike Brunson. Yeah,
lives near me in Norfolk now.
Yes, he does. Yeah, retired to Norfolk. Yeah.
What was the transition from print to broadcast easy? I mean, were you absolutely 100% confident that that was the right move at the time?
I think I was in my early 40s, and I'd been a political editor of 2 national newspapers. And how many did I work on? 4. I think I was ready for something new, and I'd done lots of broadcasting, paper reviews and everything else. And I obviously thought to myself, I really want to have a go at this. Now, I went to the BBC. I was political editor for BBC London. I was hired by a guy called Sandy Smith, who I think went on to edit Panorama and The One Show. And he won't thank me for saying it, but he said, there's a job going here. It's yours if you want it. You'll have to go before a board, but I'll tell you what to say. And
I think that still happens at the BBC.
Well, I don't know. Excuse me, I've got contact lens. and I'd done a lot of broadcasting for them, for the BBC as well, prior to that. I always say I owe my job at the BBC to the late Simon Hoggart, because we were due to do a political programme, one of those Sunday political programmes, as the two pundits, and Simon's car got stuck in traffic and I had to do the whole thing on my own. So they obviously liked me, and that's why I got the job at the BBC, and I worked with some good people there, the great Emily Maitlis, the great Joe Coburn, who've gone on to great things. And then I joined Sky. I was always friendly with Adam Bolton. Adam always used to say to me, you have to go and learn how to do TV somewhere else. Go and work for the BBC. They'll teach you how to make VTs, packages, and so on. And they are very good. The BBC are good at that. They taught me how to make VTs, taught me a bit how to structure various two-ways and various things. Learnt a lot there, one of which I often quote is never broadcast on a full bladder, which contradicts what David Cameron always used to say about speeches, wasn't it? Because he said from Enoch Powell, you should be wanting the loo when you're making a speech. I don't agree with that at all. But anyway, then I joined Sky. But
please don't tell me that you have actually had a wee live on air.
Sorry?
Please don't tell me that you've actually pissed yourself, basically.
No, certainly not.
Oh, no, damn, I thought I got an exclusive there.
No, certainly not. Although, I mean, you may know this, anybody who has broadcast for hours and hours and hours in Downing Street will tell you there's no loos there. And it's worse for cameramen actually than it is for correspondents, because they're there for
because the nearest loo from there presumably
Red Line
would be is it Red Line? I was going to say here in Fort Millbank.
No,
but,
the Red Line. You know the Red Line. You've got the doors there, and then there's a door there that goes up the stairs to the restaurant, and the gents is upstairs.
Right.
So you can actually go to the gents in the Red Line without actually going into the bar of the pub. Useful tip for you there.
Well, should I ever broadcast from Downing Street, which I suspect is unlikely? Well, let's talk about broadcasting from Downing Street, because, I mean, that is philotastic, isn't it? I mean, you can be there for... I mean, I've seen you do it. I remember Chris Mason doing one. Yeah. I don't think he was in Downing Street.
He's a rising star.
He really is. He was in the studio and he had to literally fill for about 20 minutes because all these press conferences, they always start late, don't they? What's that? I mean, do you enjoy the danger of that?
Yeah. I don't see it as a danger. I mean, I have done over the years a lot of that with Adam Bolton, him presenting, or the two of us. Yeah. I can think of lots and lots of occasions when that's happened. A recent one being, of course, the Dominic Cummings news conference in the back garden, which was May 2020, was it? Yeah. And he was so late. Adam and I had to fill for absolutely ages. I also remember another occasion when Blair made his announcement that he was going to step down when he was up at a school up in Maida Vale or somewhere, and he was late. And I remember an Ian Duncan Smith speech at the Sage in Gateshead at the Spring Forum of the Tory Party. Having to... Sometimes... I mean, you need it. I mean, one of Adam Bolton's great phrases is a two-way should be a dialogue, not a monologue. And some people have suggested that I perhaps turn it into a monologue sometimes. But if you've got a good presenter, you can bounce off. It works great. I mean, I've done a lot of two-ways recently with Dermot Murnaghan, for example, during all those votes in Parliament in, 2019, wasn't it? And Dermot and I would have to fill for ages and ages. But that day with Adam, it was Adam, the day of the Cummings news conference. And that's what we do. As you say, we have to fill when it's the press conference or the news conference, whatever the event is. The speech is late.
But have you had occasions where you've had to fill or do two ways with a presenter who doesn't quite able understand the process and what is expected of them in that?
Yes, and you have to be gentle with them. Yeah. I remember my first ever when I joined the BBC in 2001. There was a presenter called Paul Ross, I think, brother of Jonathan. Have I got that right?
Yeah.
And it was a morning radio thing, and I think it was Budget Day. And he said, well, this is Gordon Brown's sixth budget, isn't it? And I said, no, seventh. And I got ticked off my boss, don't make the presenter look stupid.
That is a really tricky one, isn't it? Because I've had
you have to politely
I've had a few of those occasions where you think, well, you've got to correct it because
you have to do it politely.
Or the viewer is otherwise, because be sure they will text in and tweet if you have got it wrong or if somebody else has got it wrong.
I think you just have to politely. You can't let something go that's wrong, because the viewer or the listener will say, well, that's wrong. And many of them are pretty knowledgeable, as we know. And you just have to, sometimes a presenter will get something slightly wrong, and you just have to say, well, actually, it's this. But as I say, on day one at the BBC, I learned to not be rude to a presenter.
In your 40 years in the lobby, what's been the main change?
Well, obviously the technology, and the speed of everything. Well, Twitter. I'm now on Instagram.
I've just started on TikTok.
Yeah, I've done that.
Have you?
Yeah.
I've no idea how you do it.
I was big on TikTok the day that a few months ago when Sajid Javid marched me off to get my booster jab.
Oh,
I was interviewing him at St Thomas's Hospital. But no, the office have put me on Instagram now. I've been on Twitter since the early days. But I was talking to my good friend Chris Hope from the Daily Telegraph. And he was saying in a very nice way, oh, it's not like it was in your day on a national newspaper. I was political editor of the Daily Express for quite a few years. And, of course, you'd probably go out for lunch with a politician. You'd come back in the afternoon and think about what the splash is going to be. I remember, we'd sort of mull over what the splash was going to be. And Chris was making the point to me, these days, you're knocking out copy all day long. And it's a much tougher job. I mean, it is a much tougher job. I mean, the other thing, the communication is just so different. I mean, I've been chairman of the press gallery and chairman of the lobby, and that was much easier in those days than these days. The poor person who chairs the lobby has got to do Zooms and dial-ins, and it's all very technical. And I think as a journalist now, I mean, I'm fortunate that I have younger colleagues to help me with Instagram and all things technical in the office. Whereas previously, all I had to do was either pick up a phone or knock something out on a typewriter. So it's the technological changes. Also, the lobby system has changed. I mean, it was all a bit Masonic when I first started. And in fact, there was a press gallery lodge. I wasn't in it. And I'm not sure if there still is. But I remember briefings there were briefings by Red Leader was the leader of the opposition. Blue Mantle, I think, was the leader of the Commons. It was Tony Newton, I think, at one point. But now, of course, you can quote the Prime Minister's spokesman by name. You never used to do that in the early days of Bernard Ingham. And do you remember in the 80s, some papers boycotted the lobby? It was the Independent when they first started. I think the Guardian did as well. I think the Scotsman did as well. So that's changed.
Didn't last long.
No.
And also...
But the technological change is the big thing, obviously.
But the fact that there's now so many female political journalists, that has changed things too. I mean, do you remember back in, the early 90s, Paul Routledge used to call the women journalists, because they used to meet together, the leather lobby. Can you imagine someone saying that now?
I didn't know Paul said that.
I know he did. Well, I don't think no, he did. He absolutely did.
And Paul Routledge, great survivor, still writing for them.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
In his 70s. There were. I mean, I remember Julia Langdon was a leading light of the lobby when I first started. Eleanor Goodman worked for the Financial Times.
But they were the exceptions, weren't they?
Yes. Yes. There was a time, I think, when the daily papers didn't have any female political editors. Well, now there are quite a few. And, of course, at the moment, we have Beth Rigby, political editor of Sky News. Laura Koonsberg has been for the last few years political editor of the BBC. Far more, yes, there are far more women political journalists now, possibly because employers are better with childcare, maternity leave. I don't know. But that is a big change. I've always said, when I was, in charge of teams like on the Daily Express, I always wanted at least one woman on the team because it's just healthy to have a mix. And there was the Sun years and years ago had a political correspondent. It was Catherine Evans, I think her name was, going back to the Trevor Kavanagh days. And the Star had, in fact, Jill Hartley worked on the Star and she was at the Sunday Times when I was there. So it's not true that there were no women, there were far fewer. And you're absolutely, that's been a big change, yes. Healthy.
What's been the most memorable moment of your 40 years? So if you look back on all the stories that you've covered.
There have been a few. I mean, there was being kissed live on TV by Joanna Lumley.
I would remember that.
That was the day of that Gurkhas vote in 2009, whenever it was. Jeremy Thompson was presenting. The day they won the vote. And I interviewed Joanna Lumley. And at the end of the interview, I turned back to the camera and she gave me a big kiss. I got the photo. And Jeremy Thompson in the studio was burst out laughing. That was a highlight.
He was a great presenter.
Yes. That Olympic Games was great. That trip to California was great. Some foreign trips have been quite memorable. There was one when Major was in great difficulty, and I remember we all got Gus O'Donnell completely drunk in a hotel room in somewhere in the Far East. I think it was Kuala Lumpur. And the next day, I think he had something like 33 messages from Major on his phone. Call me urgent. There was the time when Emily Maitlis and I were introduced to the Queen at the opening of the City Hall when Livingston was mayor, and Trevor, who of course now is a colleague at Sky News, who was chairman of the GLA, I think at the time, "Ma'am, this is Emily Maitlis and Jon Craig from the BBC," and Philip and the Queen just looked us up and just walked on without saying a word. What a snub! What a snub! Going to interview Sir Alex Ferguson. I was saying a lot of political correspondence. At the 2010 Labour Party conference, Manchester, when Sir Alex was boycotting the BBC because of row over his son, a football agent, I think. So I was the pool interviewer because Ed Miliband just been elected. He went to Carrington, the training ground, for what was described as an audience with Fergie. Now, there's a guy called Philip Townsend who used to be a press officer in Whitehall DCMS, went to become head of news at Manchester United. So he organised all this. And the night before I went to Carrington to interview Fergie, we'd been having a drink, a few of us, in one of those bars, the Hilton in Manchester, that really tall block. And he'd been telling us all about these rows Fergie has with journalists at press conferences. I went, oh, God, what's this going to be like? And I thought, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? I thought, my late father was from Glasgow, Craig, Scottish name. And so I thought I will start off with Sir Alex by talking about my late father coming from Glasgow. It worked, an absolute treat. Got a lovely interview, and all the hacks on the plane were saying, oh, it's because you're a political journalist and he's interested in politics. But I think that was rat like cunning again, wasn't it?
Well, and you have to have that. You have to know your subject when you're about to interview someone, particularly when they're famous. Yeah. And you do have to shamelessly ingratiate yourself first of all. People. Otherwise,
if you don't know them,
they don't know you from Adam. Get it? And so they inevitably are going to be a bit on the defensive at the beginning.
Perhaps, yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, we've all done interviews, haven't we, where we've been thinking, oh, God, this politician's going to be really difficult. He's going to be, he or she. And I suppose, I mean, you're a presenter, whereas I'm a correspondent and you do far more interviews than I do, but I suppose you have to, don't perhaps go in with your killer question right at the beginning.
No, you don't.
Because they might walk out.
If you know you've got a half-hour interview, you leave the killer question till minute 25.
Yeah.
And, of course, the producers are shouting in your ear, you've got nothing out of this interview.
Yeah.
And you think, no, just bide your time. And it usually works, not always.
Yeah.
Have you ever wanted to be a presenter and...
Yeah, I suggested it to John Riley once and he ignored it. John Riley is the boss of Sky News. I'd love to be a presenter. I've stood in for Adam Bolton doing political shows at Sky, and I used to present when I was at the BBC regional political programmes. I'd love to be a presenter. But the opportunity has never arisen apart from standing in for people like Adam on... He used to do a Sunday morning show. We used to do a Wednesday evening a show about PMQs, which I did quite a lot. There was a period when Adam wasn't around, and I did it quite a lot. But apart from, I've done radio presenting quite a lot. I did some when I was at the Beeb on BBC.
Did a couple of shows on LBC,
London. Yeah, I've done LBC. Yeah. I've done some for Talk Radio as well, standing in for Julia Hartley Brewer and some of their political programmes as well. So If anybody's hiring a presenter with a lot of experience in politics.
You never know. What about when it goes wrong? Because there must have been moments. I mean, you've been at Sky since 2003.
Yeah.
There must be moments that you can recall where you've just thought, oh my God, what can go wrong now?
Yeah, it's usually technical things that go wrong. And of course, I've been turned over in the Sun mainly when I have done what we call an as live, and something's gone wrong and I've sworn. And the producer has put out the wrong version and not the flawless version. There was one when I swore, and then there was another one when I swore when the bongs of Big Ben went. And the producer put that one out. And then there was another occasion which...
You sound like Boris Johnson blaming everyone else but yourself.
Well, a bit harsh. There was one, I was interviewing Len McCluskey in Brighton a few years back at the TUC conference. Now, in Brighton, you've got that conference centre and there is a balcony right at the top overlooking the sea. You point the camera that way, you've got a lovely shot of the pier. You point the camera that way, there's a shot of the old burnt-out pier. It looks great. To get a better shot of the pier and the beach and everything, we quite often have to stand on a box. And I'd done my interview with McCluskey, I think I'd done it, yeah. And I was doing a live late off the back of it, I think. And I was on this really precarious, rickety, wobbly box, and it was windy as hell. And I thought the grab of McCluskey was longer than it was. And so I let out an oath, shall we say, not realising that the grab of McCluskey had finished. And it sounded as though I was making a comment about what Len McCluskey had just said. Oh, and of course I got turned over in Guido Fawkes and everywhere else, you know. And next time I saw Len, he said, "Hey, no swearing." Yeah.
Give me three of the most impressive politicians that you've ever met.
That's quite easy.
Well, I'll make it 10 then.
No. Number one's got to be Blair. Do you want me to say why?
Yeah.
I mean, this nonsense. This nonsense about he's not getting a knighthood. You know, the mad left and the mad right. And you know, Blair was Prime Minister for 10 years. I've always been a Blair fan. I was saying earlier, I knew him since the day he was elected. I see him every now and again. Still on very good terms with him. And good to interview. I tell you who else impressed me massively. 2015 election, you can probably guess who I'm going to say. I went up and spent a lot of time with our brilliant Scottish correspondent, James Matthews, in Scotland, because that was the election when they won, SNP won 56 of the 59 seats. Nicola Sturgeon, brilliant campaigner, very impressive. Now, there's somebody also who was brilliant with the media. You know, on occasions when a press officer, oh no, she hasn't got time for an interview, she'd do one. Yeah. Asked her, you know, and just such a great campaigner. And I suppose I'd better have a Conservative in there.
You don't have to.
I mean, I suppose you've probably got to say Thatcher, haven't you? I always got on fine with Major, got on well with Cameron. I knew Boris Johnson. The first time I met Boris Johnson was when he was a trainee at the Times and I was at the Sunday Times, and he said, "Oh, Jon Craig, big byline." And what I always say now is, now Boris is the big byline.
It's the big dog.
Yeah, Operation Big Dog. But, I mean, Thatcher was... I mean, I was a very young political correspondent, so I wasn't close to Thatcher in any way, although I always got on very well with Bernard. I worked for... There was a boss at Thomson Regional Newspapers that ran the evening paper team called Gordon Jackson, same name as the famous Scottish actor. And he was from Yorkshire and very matey with Bernard, so that helped. I thought Cameron was pretty good with journalists. Major could be quite tetchy. Gordon could be difficult. Gordon chased me out of number 10 when I asked him about his expenses during the expenses scandal.
Well, literally.
Yeah, I remember I was there with Nick Robinson and Tom Bradby, and he didn't like the questioning about... There was some bizarre story about the expenses for cleaning his flat. Do you remember that story? It was right at the beginning of the Telegraph expenses thing. Boris Johnson, well, I have thought for some time that his lies may catch up with him at some point. I've always said Heseltine was impressive. I've always said one of my corny jokes I use a million times is the Tory party has always loved a glamorous blonde. Thatcher, Heseltine, Johnson.
Do you like politicians?
Yeah, most of them. There are a few I'm not keen on. I'm not going to tell you who they are.
Well, you can't really save that for the memoirs.
Yeah.
Yes,
in the answer to your question, yes. Do I enjoy being with politicians at events like party conferences? Yeah, I love party conferences. Because you get a better chance to be with politicians probably than we do in Parliament. I mean, the restrictions, obviously, with COVID in the last year or so made our job harder. And it was actually a joy when we could go back into Parliament and start meeting up with politicians properly again. So, yes, I do like politicians. And I'd probably say I'm friendly with a few of them, yes.
Because a lot of people
doesn't mean I give them an easy time.
Well,
if
no,
I'm interviewing
but
them.
that's the thing. In that a lot of people who are viewers and listeners to my programme, to yours as well, they think that we're all in it together. That there's some cosy little stitch up, and there isn't. I mean, you know that from both sides there is a game being played sometimes, and you know that a politician can only go so far sometimes. But there's no conspiracy, is there? And that's what, of course, social media has fueled now. That all the conspiracy theories about about all people. I mean, people know what my politics are, but I have no clue what your politics are. And I think the media's changed in that way, in that people like me, I don't think would have been able to present the kind of programmes that I do 20 years ago, whereas I can now. Do you think that's a healthy thing?
I think there's a trend now, isn't there, for radio presenters in particular, and perhaps some of the new TV channels for presenters with opinions rather than impartial presenters. So that's a trend, not necessarily a bad thing. It probably makes for more interesting programmes. And most channels like yours probably have a mix of presenters, a mix of views. I mean, I met my wife is involved in politics. She works in Parliament for a Conservative MP. Has worked for lots of MPs over the years.
She worked in the next door office to me when I worked there.
She reminded me actually that my wife Caroline and I and somebody tried to fix you up on a blind date once.
They did. This is about 1986.
Yeah, well, that's about she started working. She worked for Michael Anken for a long time.
I think she was working for Richard Ryder.
She worked for Richard Ryder, who I think was Geoffrey Howe's PP, but went on to be Chief Whip, of course.
Yeah.
She worked for Steve Norris, John Whittingdale, Mark Garnier, who famously or infamously called her sugar tits and asked her to go and buy some sex toys, and was investigated by Sue Gray. So Caroline was interviewed by Sue Gray. Mark Garnier had to apologise.
She could make a few bob writing columns on that experience this week, couldn't she?
Yes. She's working for an MP called Mark Logan now, who's the MP for Bolton North East. But so we met actually at the Live Point outside the Hilton, what's it called in Birmingham? Hyatt's Regency, the tall. So we're a sort of Westminster couple, I suppose you'd call us that.
Which is probably works quite well in the sense that she knows what the pressures are on you, and you know what the pressures are on her.
Yeah, it's just stuff she won't tell me because she knows it'll be straight on the telly or on Twitter or wherever.
Surely not.
Yeah, she has to be discreet. It always is, of course.
Well, it's been fascinating hearing so many fantastic anecdotes. I know everyone that's listening or watching will have enjoyed them, and I'm sure there'll be a few more to come. Jon Craig, thank you very much.
Thank you for asking. Been a pleasure.
Join us again next time on Iain Dale All Talk. Goodbye.